Okay, I'm going to steal a question that Strange, I think, was probably going to ask, so he can shoot me later. But how does your faith
Mhm.
kind of affect your company? What kind of stuff you want to develop? What kind of elements you're putting into your games? Because I know I looked just a little bit ago at kind of your backstory, and then you were mentioning back in 2005, or your company was talking about seeing a certain game and seeing kind of like what was out there, wanted to do something different. So, how does your faith basically affect what you want to do and what you're doing in your company?
Yeah. I don't know. What do you think? First off, what's your first impressions on that? Because I have a lot to unpack if you want to. But
We got time.
Well, uh, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I want to give you a once upon a time story, just real quick. So, you've all heard of GDC that's in San Francisco, the Game Developers Conference that
yes.
happens every year. I was lucky enough to be at the Game Developers Conference when Peter Molyneux and Sid Meier were there as like keynote speakers, and I was like fanboy, like, oh, they're so cool. Well, at a certain point, I discovered probably like a decade and a half ago about CGDC, which is like Christian Game Developer Conference that was happening in Oregon. And
Wow.
I was living in Southern California at the time. And so, starting to go to that, I really loved it and met some people there, met Neil there
Yeah.
actually. And so at a certain point, I had moved from Southern California to the Seattle area in Washington. And I also met a friend that was living in Canada who said, "Hey, you're going to go to CGDC? I'll drive down and I'll pick you up and we'll go." And so it became this really cool road trip. And along the way, I met the Miller brothers pretty much. And that's when it was the first time I ever heard of Redwall, and they were talking about this IP, and I was like, they were explaining it like woodland characters, like in like medieval battle fantasy kind of thing, and I was like, yeah, that's pretty cool. And you know, just randomly, years later,
Mm.
I was sitting down at this table, and they were like, "What do you think about making a Redwall kind of cooking game?" And I was like, sign me up. Like, this is really cool. I've been in the game industry for like 20 years, and the video game industry is predominantly secular for sure,
Mhm.
but I've really tried for the last 20 years to just kind of make kids games as I've gone. So I've done like a SpongeBob SquarePants game and like a Disney Pixar Cars game and like a Club Penguin game, and so my most recent one was like Call of Duty though. But
A
I
little
was,
different. But the
yeah,
team is a
I
little
was like,
different too.
well, not necessarily a kids game, but it was, you know, I loved playing the Call of Duty, but I wasn't necessarily sure wanted to make such a violent kind of game. But I do believe that, where my faith journey has been is kind of like, well, keep on trying to make, more wholesome, neat, cool games. So when Feast and Friends and the Redwall series came up, I was like, yeah, that's really cool. I think that would be really fun to discover it and explore what Redwall is.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I wish we could turn the camera around because we have this amazing like red
Yeah,
wall facade right around here, and it's really cool looking.
Oh, nice.
And Soma Games has been like a fantastic team to work with, and uh, where I'm able to explore and grow and talk about my faith, in games. And sometimes that conversation is about like, well, what's really cool secular games and what kind of you know possible Christian games, faith-based type of games. We've talked about games that could be kind of more like Lion Witch in the Wardrobe, where it's kind of more of that faith based, and I personally think that there's much more open road for that kind of stuff, I think, in the future. Where in my personal opinion, like in the past, it's like when I talk to a bunch of other people about like Christian games, they're like, boo, not too on board with that kind of thing. But I think as we're moving, into the wild west still with technology and where we're at right now, I think there's some more open-mindedness to where it's like, hey, let's explore, some really cool ways of making those games and ways of fellowship and networking in that space, that Christian themed space. So I'm stoked, and I'm really excited to be part of exploring all those avenues, honestly.
Nice. And then I was just thinking about Christian Game Developers Conference. That's where a lot of us met, was kind of through that. So just sharing and having faith as part of the workspace was a piece of that. But for content, right, for creating the games and creating things we want to make that has at least kingdom-minded storytelling, right? Things that are more what we call family values. Well, those values come from somewhere, so we're bringing them from what the Bible talks about. More towards the C.S. Lewis approach, is what we talk about at Soma Games. We've really leaned in that direction. Both Tolkien and Lewis did an awesome job with storytelling, similar to what Jesus did with parables. Right? Yeah. Take a parable, go for it. It relates to kingdom. He's talking about God, but he's talking more in metaphor. So we love using that in a lot of our storytelling, and most of our games tend towards heavy storytelling, heavy narrative, which allows us to then bring a lot more good content out to the world. So that's one piece of the puzzle, is the group of people we work with, plus how we share that content through story. I think the other thing we're trying to really wrestle with is how can we also have gameplay, right, meld with the story in the world, right, that is now kingdom oriented. So that's another piece we've been kind of wrestling through. So can you make a Christian horror game? Maybe.